Real Deal Neil here, and I want to welcome you back to another episode of Southwest Magazine. I'd also like to welcome a new guest, Mr. Matthew Martin, and our returning colleague, Dr. Timothy Christie. Today, we hope to have a very open discussion as a follow-up to our previous discussion related to systemic racism in New Brunswick. There's been some things happening, and an election always brings out excitement. And today, we hope to get to the bottom of some discussions and some statements that were made recently by a leader of a political party here in New Brunswick. Dr. Christie, would you like to lead into that for us?
Yeah, well, the leader of the People's Alliance of New Brunswick, his name's Mr. Austin, I think Chris Austin. Mm-hmm. He was interviewed earlier this week, and some of the comments he made, he was asked straight up about systemic racism and discrimination, and he said he doesn't think it exists. He doesn't think New Brunswick is a racist province. He conflated the two. So he said, if systemic racism exists, that means New Brunswick is a racist province. He said no one's ever been able to give him a definition of systemic racism. So he said, he challenges people. He said, I challenge someone to show me a piece of legislation or something that fosters discrimination and racism.
Some evidence, right?
Exactly. So I want to say to Mr. Austin, I accept your challenge. I've written a paper, I've published it on Medium, I've sent it, distributed it widely, given it to the provincial government and the council in St. John, where I explain exactly what pieces of legislation in New Brunswick, mainly the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, that fosters systemic discrimination.
Right.
So I accept Austin's challenge. I've published my paper. The thoughts are there. I'll talk about them in detail today with you folks.
Excellent.
But I want to tell him in no uncertain terms. It exists. There is legislation that fosters systemic discrimination in New Brunswick, and he's just flat out wrong. He's mistaken.
Agreed. Mr. Martin?
Matthew,
what's your take on this?
I think really for any white individual to come into a discussion about racism, they don't really have a point where they can chime in, because at any point, if you can say as a white male you've never seen as any type of white individual and say you've never seen or experienced systemic racism, well, of course you haven't. You're not the person that it would affect. You'd either be the person who is outright being racist, setting up that system that fails our black communities, our indigenous communities, or you're just blind to it and choose to ignore it.
Agreed. So, and today we're hoping to have a very open discussion in this platform. So when I listened to Mr. Austin's statements on a national radio platform, what I heard was a lot of, inaccuracies, right? I heard that there's no real clear definition for systemic racism. Well, I know there was a Supreme Court of Canada decision out of Quebec recently, and they talked about systemic discrimination or systemic racism. He suggests that there's no racism in New Brunswick, or racism. New Brunswick is not a racist province. Now, that's almost to suggest that racism doesn't exist, and it makes me beg the question, why would we have a Human Rights Act? Why would we have a Human Rights Commission if it were not to protect against things like systemic discrimination? So I was very surprised by the comments. Any further comment from you, Dr. Christie?
Yeah. Well, what Austin did is the typical fallacy of equivocation. He takes a term, redefines it as if it's meaningful, but the redefinition of the term is a red herring. So what he says is systemic discrimination means New Brunswick is a racist province. Doesn't mean that at all.
No.
Doesn't mean that at all. I grew up in New Brunswick. My family are here in New Brunswick. I work in New Brunswick. I was educated in New Brunswick. It doesn't mean that the province is a racist province for systemic discrimination to exist. So the first thing I want to say to Austin is you're just wrong. By making the fallacy of equivocation and redefining the term, you're playing political bull. You're not actually talking about anything meaningful. But if I give an example, if I'm the victim of systemic discrimination, so let's say I'm the victim of racial discrimination in the sense that I'm denied a job, or I'm fired from a job, or someone doesn't give me an apartment, or I'm denied housing, or I'm not allowed provided service at a restaurant or somewhere. So a clear case of racial discrimination. I can't call the police and have them enforce my rights. If another crime, any other crime that happens, I can call the police. The police will go and investigate. If they have reasonable and probable cause, they'll actually arrest the person. They'll interrogate the person. They'll talk to the Crown about pressing charges on the person, and then the Crown might actually pursue charges on the person. If I'm the victim of racial discrimination, I don't have that option in New Brunswick. I cannot call the police. The police will not enforce my rights. We saw an example in Halifax recently where a taxi driver was accosted by a racist passenger and told off completely, and the taxi driver tried to call the police, and the police said there's nothing we can do. So the first thing I want to say to Austin is, look, a clear example of systemic discrimination is us people who are victims of discrimination have no actual legal recourse in New Brunswick. We can't call the police to enforce our rights. Other people, when their rights are violated, they can. I have a lot of comments on the Human Rights Act itself that I want to talk about, but we'll get into that. But I'll let Matthew jump into.
Mr. Martin?
I mean, to me, as a black individual, I've experienced systemic racism. I've experienced racism on an everyday basis. You know, for me, and I think to speak as any person of color, any like minority, to not be able to, you know, have any type of tool besides going through to our human rights, which I know we'll discuss more. There's nothing for an individual, your average, you know, just your average guy, who is, you know, I was, you know, you can rent an apartment now without being seen, but you know, you could walk into that apartment and then they'd come do an apartment check and they go, oh, we just let a black male in here, you know, we can't let him live here. And then a month later you have an eviction notice and you're out on your butt with nowhere to go. In those situations there, you're then running a huge paper trail of just trying to, you know, to have something done. And at that point, what is that something? You know, there's
no real remedy is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no remedy. There's not even, you know, an even solid process. It's kind of up in the air, and you know, in a couple of years something might happen.
That's right.
If I can just focus back on Austin's statements, and I just want to be real, because this is a, you know, authentic conversation about what's concerning us. Chris Austin's statements, quite frankly, scared me. Because if we watch that daily, that 24/7 news cycle that's coming out of the States right now, these are the kind of statements that are being made by the administration down in the States about the Black Lives Matter movement down there, and how it's not rooted in racism, it's just crazy protesters. So on a daily basis, the administration down there makes statements which provides, I guess, permission for people who are radical and do not believe that systemic racism exists or that there is a challenge in the States, gives them permission to do what they do. And I felt fear because when I heard Mr. Austin make those statements, he told the entire province, the majority of the province, don't worry, it doesn't exist. And for those who know, who are engaging in systemic racism or racial discrimination, they've now been given permission to continue because it doesn't exist, and what they're doing isn't wrong because it doesn't exist. And in the same token, I really must say, and I don't have any backup for this, but it just feels righteous, in my opinion, being the leader of a public political party, for him to say in a position of authority that systemic racism doesn't exist, I think that is in itself systemic discrimination against every black, brown, and indigenous person in the province. I believe that he has discriminated against me and taken away my right to express the indignation of systemic racism. If I do that now, with the with the backing of his statement, who are they going to believe? Yeah. Just my thoughts.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Neil, because if you dissect his comments a little bit, the contradictions are manifest. So, for instance, he says there is racism, but not systemic discrimination, or just systemic racism. So let's just follow the logic. Who would be the racist? A person. What if that person is in a position of authority? Say they're a judge or a lawyer or a doctor or a professor or a school teacher. Now you have a racist in position of power or authority, and they can use that to make decisions. So if we look at some things happening in St. John, there are decisions that would be made, maybe motivated by racism, maybe not. But the end result is that you have, say, an all-white police commission, or you have an all-white city council, or you have an all-white provincial government, or whatever it's going to be. So when Austin says that...
Now, some folks would, devil's advocate, some folks would say that's about demographics, Dr. Christie.
Yeah.
And public and private citizens' interest in engaging in the process, right?
They can say that, but it doesn't make it true. Right? So there's a famous saying that every system is perfectly designed to get the outcomes it gets.
Yes.
So if we look at the outcomes, all white board for the hospital corporations, all white city councils, all white provincial government, all white administrations in some of our institutions.
And I think we spoke this morning, Matthew, you weren't there, but we were talking briefly about the original charter of St. John, for which I wear the coat of arms today. And that original charter basically disenfranchised blacks as being human in the city of St. John during that period in time. What happened is they changed the charter. And as you said, that didn't remove the discrimination, that just changed the charter.
Yeah, exactly. It's
right?
like taking down the sign that says no colors
like,
allowed.
Hey, it's like saying, we didn't write this way on purpose, so we're going to change it now. But everything behind it exists still. The actual systemic piece is still there.
Exactly.
It makes no sense. Matthew, talk to us about, I know you've got a really strong example of systemic racism coming out of our hometown, St. John. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so, with the Black Lives Matter movement rising up, there's been a lot of outcry for St. John to diversify our police force, not only our police force, our school systems, our hospitals, our city workers. Questions have been asked. How many? What's the ethnic number? And I sat in meetings and go, we don't know. They don't keep track of that. Well, everybody keeps track of that kind of information. But when it comes to our police board, we have an all-white police board. Within the last couple of months, they had 2 seats available on that police board. In that time, they had an open call for possible new members to put an application in to join. And from information I know, we had 3 successful black men apply for that position. Time has passed now, and they've announced the board, and our police board still maintains to be an all-white police board. Even with all the outcry in the city of let's diversify the police board, because there needs to be a lot more transparency. It went from being a boys club to a lot of mixed gender on there now, but we still have that all-white police board. And when I raised that question, why wasn't there diversity put in? It was brought back. We brought on 2 women, which is absolutely phenomenal. But they've also maintained keeping women in position on the police board. So that was never a problem. What they've struggled to do is maintain a position for someone of color, someone from our minority community on that board, and they've struggled to maintain someone there to represent our community. And if someone is there, they weave them out, or they don't accept, a reapplication from them. Yeah, it's nothing kept there. And it comes back to where in their system of you can come onto this board works. From the individuals that I know joined, some of them are very well scholared, very well educated, and we don't see any of them on the board, and it would be a perfect spot for them to be.
So Dr. Christie, you were a former member of this board.
Yeah, I was on the police board, I think from 2010 to 14 or something. I was on for 1 term. I was eligible to be reappointed, and because I wouldn't play or fit well in the all-white old boys club that they had, I wasn't reappointed. I have lots of things to say about the commission. When I was on it, they didn't do anything particularly useful. They were focused on the wrong things, and the chair at the time had no priority, so he really had a problem figuring out what's important. But I do know explicitly that because I couldn't fit into the old boys club, they were very uncomfortable with me on the board, and I wasn't reappointed when my term came up.
So what?
In terms of Matthew's comments, I think it's important to say the people making that decision are white people that are the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Right? So this is where the systemic stuff comes in.
Thank you, sir.
You have people in positions of power that have this type of bias. It could be an unconscious bias, but they're using it and it's influencing the decisions they're making. And as a result, our system is perfectly designed to make sure that we have an all-white police commission, for example.
Wow.
And I mean, to elaborate from that, they've gone as far as to say, we need to have a community board. Myself received an invite for that community board, and taking a look at the list of individuals who are on there, is we have now a minority ethnic black board, and we have our all-white police board with a very strong wall in between them that we might take what you say and implement it here. But as far as, talking to the police commission board, who actually would, go to the chief and say, and Tim, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but they go to the chief and say, this is kind of what needs to start happening. Then the chief can say, okay, let's put this into play, or vice versa. We now have a wall of, here is our minority group, and here's our white board, and here's the wall. Stay on your own side.
So basically they've actually implemented some systemic discrimination by giving us a board of powerless people.
Exactly.
That's awesome, isn't it? And another piece of that is, because we are going to be running short for time, and we got a lot to talk about in the coming episodes, and we will definitely express those ideas there. But another real good example of systemic discrimination is my 47 years in the education system, only having been exposed to Black history once, right? I think that's a perfect example of systemic discrimination, and you want to maybe elaborate on that for me?
Yeah. So currently now, there, in regards to New Brunswick specifically, we'll keep it close to home.
Yeah, sure.
It's a very hit and miss of what you might learn. You might hear stories of, I learned about something here for Black history. I learned a little bit here. But as it stands, there's no concrete, everyone learns A, B, and C. Nothing when it comes to
There are no
Black
Black history outcomes in Brunswick.
There's none. And it's wild to think about, because New Brunswick does have a very rich Black history.
The Underground Railroad ended in Perth.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Anybody know that before this year?
Yeah.
I didn't.
Well, and in fact, I was talking to a museum curator recently, and he said that there's a house outside of Fredericton that still has chains in the basement.
Yeah.
There, where slaves were kept.
I know we're getting a little off topic, but there's a church in Kingston, New Brunswick that up until my brother got married there had chains in the basement.
Yep.
Right? So these are discussions that we have as a community, and we understand the history of it. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about why the wider community, when they hear these stories, why can't they understand our perspective?
I think it's probably the same level of ignorance that Austin has.
Yeah.
So if a person doesn't experience racism or discrimination, and they don't think about racism or discrimination, and it doesn't impact their life, it's really easy not to notice it.
Agreed. But can we all agree a large chunk of this is the fact that we're Black and we have a Black perspective?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's very clear
We're,
that
we're the ones that get followed when we walk in a store. We're the
Right.
ones that are stopped for no reason by the police. We're the ones that the police remember the next time they stop us.
Yes.
We're the ones that might not get to sit at the window in a
We're
restaurant.
the ones that, we thought you were somebody else that we're looking for.
Yes.
Conveniently.
As you and I have experienced most recently, I've been Dr. Christie for weeks on end, and you've been Neil Clements and Dr. Christie in 1 week.
It's very difficult to tell us apart sometimes.
I understand that, but I'm handsome. I know, Mr. Martin, you're handling a lot of change right now in St. John. Maybe you can touch on a few pieces, and then when we come back next week, you can really roll some things out that you're involved in.
Yeah, so I one thing that I've really, taken, I guess, under my belt and stuff that I'd like to push forward. I think it's important that we have New Brunswick's Black history in our
Yep.
in our provincial school system.
Yeah.
You know, I speak a lot with with Dr. Christie, and I'm completely on board with racial discrimination needing to be a criminal offense.
Absolutely.
So I plan in the future, you know,
Yeah.
Dr. Christie and I will be hanging out a lot and attending a lot of meetings to help push that forward, because I think, you know, not only as a provincial but at a federal level for here in Canada, that I think that's definitely something we can
Absolutely, yeah.
achieve.
And even I would suggest only at the minimum standard that the government would have a look at opening up the legislation we have in the minimum standard and discussing possible changes to create real enforcement,
Absolutely.
right?
And it makes no sense. Right now, the Human Rights Act, the Human Rights Commission, they're both a joke. The Human Rights Commission, to get through that process, the UNB women's hockey team filed a complaint in
Right.
2008. It wasn't resolved till 2016.
None of those kids were playing hockey anymore.
Exactly. So they were all deprived this opportunity. The commission last year settled like 14 or 40 cases or something out of 240 they had. It was like 16% of their caseload they settled. It takes years to get through it. Even if you get through the process, they don't treat discrimination as a crime. They treat it as an issue that needs to be mediated. So I would like to say
Yeah.
as clearly as possible, if someone suffers or is a victim of racial discrimination, they should be able to call the police, and the police should have to go and enforce the law of making it a crime. And they should be able to arrest that person. They should be able to look at the facts. They should be able to interrogate the person. They should be able to press charges on the person. And that person, if they've committed an egregious enough offense, should actually go to jail. And if we have racists that, because of their racist behavior, end up with criminal records, then they won't be able to maintain the positions they have of power in society.
Exactly.
And this will be one of the ways we can get them out of the system so that we can start dismantling systemic discrimination.
One brick at a time.
I agree with that statement.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for your time today. I think this has been a really authentic and useful discussion, and I hope that our viewers get some perspective about the topics we're discussing today, because they're very important to everybody, not just the Black, Brown, and Indigenous community. It's important to New Brunswick as a province. So we really need to focus on our leadership and what types of leadership that we are bringing into the fray. And I can only suggest, based on my perspective as a Black individual in New Brunswick, that the statements of Mr. Austin, they quite frankly scared me.
In my opinion, Mr. Austin has no business being in our government based on the things he said. That gentleman certainly will not be representing me.
Well, the statements he made were fundamentally inaccurate and not true. So, again, it scared me to know that someone in his position could make such statements to the public, basically discriminating against and taking away what little power I have to protect my own rights by saying that doesn't exist. And all of you Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks whom are in the Indigenous communities in the middle of right now having hearings about deaths that were absolutely avoidable to humans who were killed in wellness checks. This makes no sense. And we know that was related to systemic discrimination.
That's right.
So his comments...
You know, I can give you an example. In the hospitals where I work, we have combative patients. We have patients under the influence of things. They can be violent. We don't kill any of them. We don't need to kill them to get them under control.
Right.
Could you imagine a doctor saying, this person's combative and belligerent and my solution is to kill them? This is the
Well done, well said.
the insanity of the way that we police our people. These are our brothers and sisters in our community, and our solution is to do this type of thing to them. It makes no sense.
Might I just make a comment on your comment when you said these are our brothers and sisters in this community? I believe that we are all a community, and that my background is Irish, Native, Black, and otherwise, right? So I'm really, I believe in that collective community, but I do absolutely accept that the perspective of the majority community in our province is not mine. And it's evidenced on a daily basis through comments like Mr. Austin's. If you would agree with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, you know, at the end of the day, with our police force, there's no one keeping anybody accountable to say, you know, there's no systemic racism in New Brunswick. Who are you to say that?
Mm-hmm.
And who's keeping him accountable?
Right.
Here he is as a political leader, as we said, and he is, you know, pretty much putting it out as free range for individuals who are out performing racist acts,
mm-hmm.
who are enabling a system of discrimination, and he's saying, you guys are good over there, it's not happening. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, everybody who's experiencing it and seeing this political leader is dying on the inside, because now mm-hmm. they've just opened that door of a flood that it mm-hmm. just gives everybody the permission to continue what they're doing.
He said it wasn't even real. What are you talking about? It was on CBC yesterday. Didn't you hear it?
And the foolish statement was, nobody can define it for me.
I know.
That's the most cowardly way of approaching a complex issue, is to look at semantics and definitions.
Jump on Netflix.
And notwithstanding the semantics of that, the use of the language and the definitions, there is definitions available of systemic discrimination. The court has treated it, legislatures have treated it. It's not new information mm-hmm. for anybody who's ever read a human rights, any human rights legislation, right? Or someone in the position of Mr. Austin has the ability to find the resource, turn the page, and read the words.
He doesn't have to be bothered with this issue.
That's right, because he does not have the perspective of systemic discrimination and how it affects you on a daily basis.
And if we need to, you know, define it for him, if he can't understand, you know, we can really dumb it down. There's tons of episodes and shows on Netflix that specifically talk to
I know.
the topic.
We're living in an environment right now of 24/7. The lights are on, all to see, systemic discrimination. You can't hide from me. But yet, they try to bury it.
That's right. But and the paper I published on Medium, mm-hmm. so I put it there intentionally so that anybody can look at it.
Right.
But it specifically looks at the Criminal Code of Canada mm-hmm. and the New Brunswick Human Rights Act and explains in detail why these two pieces of legislation perpetuate systemic discrimination. On
that point, hold that thought, Dr. Christie. And Matthew, I know you wanted to have some more commentary. Why don't we save this, move this into our next episode where we'll explore further discussions of systemic discrimination or the lack thereof or non-existence thereof in New Brunswick. And maybe we can bring in some other examples from our community. And I think people need to see, right? They need to hear, because they're not experiencing our lives. And I think it's best that we share our stories. So maybe next week we'll come back and we'll share some reality for the province. What do you think?
Excellent, brother.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Dr. Christie.
All right.
Bam.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO-TV, New Brunswick's only source for independent community television.